Hi, my name is Crystal. This Saturday night, the UFC returns, and BetStamps has joined up with the Todd Atkins Show to provide a one-stop shop website for all of your gambling needs. When you visit Todd's page, signupexpert.com/TAS, you'll be connected to all of the sports books in your region, along with a review of each platform and its unique benefits. All of these sports books have valuable offers for new users. So when you register through my link, you'll automatically receive the top offers at each one. So if you want to take advantage of these benefits and support the Todd Atkins Show, please consider signing up for your next sports book at expertsignup.com/TAS. Again, my name is Crystal, and you can find me on TikTok at unapologeticallyme0424. Happy gambling!
What's up, everybody? It's your boy Drew with High Fight IQ, and you are now watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with my boys Todd Atkins and Miguel Inoue. Miguel has been the matchmaker for over 200 shows worldwide and has worked with Hook and Shoot, Euphoria, Bodog, and ADCC. Make sure you subscribe to the Todd Atkins Show on YouTube. You can also find Miguel on his YouTube channel at MMA Collector 74. Don't forget to subscribe to High Fight IQ on all social media platforms, the House Call Sports on YouTube, the Fight Pit on YouTube. Now let's talk some fights, baby. Let's go.
All right, so it's Todd Atkins. I'm here with Miguel Inoue and very special guest Zach Arnold, who's been writing in the MMA space for God knows how long. Pro Wrestling Power, Fight Opinion, MMA Draw, many other things. Right, Zach?
I'm still alive. How are we all doing?
All right, so and today we're going to be discussing Enson Inoue's recent arrest for drug-laced candy bars, chocolate bars. And, before we do that, I want, Zach, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself to people that are listening to this.
Well, I started in the mid to late 90s covering Pancrase and also the Japanese various promotions, the start of Pride. And this was long before there was machine translation online for people to do articles. And I was doing play-by-play during dial-up modem era. So that's how old I am. But nonetheless, had a lot of fun, did a lot of translating, and had some friends in photography over there in Japan. And we covered a lot of shows and did a lot of things before SureDog exploded and all of whatever that entailed. So nonetheless, I've been around, and I'm still around, and it's a very different world, but it's a very curious world. And one thing I do notice, and I'm glad you and Miguel are doing your show, because it's important to hear from people who actually live this. There's way too many people who now cover the scene who have no idea what the scene used to be and are now trying to tell the history of the sport, and they have no idea what they're talking about, but they're so confident and they're so arrogant, they'll trash people like us who actually lived it.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Miguel, why don't you, I'll let you comment on that since you're a big historian as well.
No, I agree completely. I'll go back to the article or the interview with Dana White that you recently showed, where Dana's the billionaire at the end of the day, and we coined the phrase "always bet on white" instead of the "always bet on black" thing. And the guy's kind of been on a winning streak, so he gets to write history, and he paints himself as the only expert. And I don't think that's the case. I think he's whitewashed a lot of history away, including UFC history. Not just forget about if it's not UFC. If it's not UFC, it doesn't even exist in his mind. But even a great deal of old UFC history, he's letting go by the wayside, and he doesn't really seem to care. And I don't think that's right. So I appreciate when I hear a name like Zach Arnold pop up again, because I know that he's a guy who's going to have a set of experience that's going to entail depth, and that's what's important here.
Now, Zach,
And
I'm
just a
sorry.
comment, real quick. I'm sorry, Todd, but I got to speak in because Miguel makes a great point about Dana White, and we're seeing it recently with Ari Emanuel. Endeavor is really enabling Dana's behavior. Dana's lost some power, but he still has image, and part of that system, that Ari Emanuel system, is they're really letting Dana White go crazy when it comes to rewriting history. In fact, just as we speak right now, they signed a deal with Roku to do this docu-series on UFC. And basically the history of UFC is 2001 moving forward. And even then, you're only getting parts of the early Zuffa history. You're not even getting much, if anything, about Pride or about Japan or Hawaii. And certainly when we talk about Enson Inoue, Enson's a legend. And it's so sad to see so many people, especially in America, who knew him or was his friend or did business with him. No one is speaking up on his behalf after he got arrested here. It's really alarming to see how few people who could stand up have not stood up for him at all. And part of that's because Dana has been so successful at whitewashing history, pardon the pun, that the pressure, the social pressure to basically give up and surrender into whatever the UFC narrative about MMA history is, you have to either go along with it or you're just considered an enemy of the sport.
Well, let me ask you something. You just said stand up. Now, I know Enson well. I'm just asking you, like, how could they stand up for him necessarily, just so I understand?
But no one's even commenting publicly on his behalf. No one's saying, well, it's a sad situation or we don't know the facts, but we support him nonetheless. He's done a lot for the business, and
yeah,
let's just wait for until something happens. But no one's even standing up for him on that front. No one's even acknowledging that he's in trouble. It's the most bizarre set of circumstances I've seen, and this is something I see now, given UFC's heavy hand in the industry. A lot of the old-time veteran fighters, they're kind of left to their own devices, and they're not sticking up for each other. Everyone's kind of on their own separate camps, and if you don't stick together, then you got the monopoly that's going to rewrite your own history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no one loves Enson more than me. I spent a lot of time with him when I was in Japan, and man, it was frustrating for me to see it, because I mean, he had got in trouble before, obviously, and I know he loves Japan, but it was like, I mean, I feel bad for him, but it's like me, I don't use any substances. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't do any of that. So I'm just like, for me, it's like, do you love Japan to the point you want to stay there, or are you willing to risk it, for things? But I mean,
well, we don't even know. We don't even exactly know how they detected what they detected. We just know what they're claiming, which is they got magic mushrooms and candy bars. I mean, it's the most ridiculous story I've ever heard.
Yeah, I mean, apparently, we got a guy in our chat. We have a chat here that we have on Instagram, and he does the podcast with Enson, the Yamato Damashi podcast. And I think when he talked to him, he got to talk to him. And he wasn't really, he's saying he's ready to take whatever punishment they give. I'm not saying, okay, guilty or innocent or whatever. I'm just kind of commenting on what's happened. Maybe you could kind of give people more of a rundown on exactly what went down.
The story, and again, this is just the police story, and this is not anything in court. They've just arrested him. They've accused him of sending candy bars in Ghirardelli boxes last month from his home in Hawaii, and they claim that there were magic mushrooms in the candy bars, and they detected it at customs, and then they arrested him and his wife Sarah at their home in Saitama, and so he's sitting in a jail cell, and if you know Japanese politics, they put foreigners through the ringer on drug arrests, and it's not like habeas corpus in America where you've got to show me the body and show me the crime. They can put him through the ringer until they either get a confession or they politically put him in a situation where someone's got to come to his rescue, and I don't see anyone coming to his rescue right now.
Yeah, I know the first time he did 28 days. I forgot how long they can hold him without charging him. I want to say it's 21.
At least a month.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of wrote about some of the responses from people. I know I'd seen Shin Yaoki's comment, but maybe talk about that a little bit.
Oh, the sanctimony of everyone burying Enson in Japan. It's just ridiculous. They want him to be the tough old guy on television. They want him for the reality shows. And then the minute that he's accused of something, all of a sudden, no, we didn't know he was trouble. We didn't know he was this tough guy. We didn't know any of this. I mean, it's the hypocrisy and the absolute inability to defend a guy who did something for them. You know, that is not the old method of Yakuza spirit in Japan. This is not the old days of protecting nationalism and actually protecting honor, or at least trying to minimize trouble. Now, the people in the MMA scene in Japan, they're as worthless as Americans when it comes to throwing people under the bus.
Hmm. Yeah, I only saw Aoki's comment. Did you see anything else that I missed? Or
I mean, there's just a few YouTubers and Yakuza types, or wannabe types, as I call them, the ones who have tattoos all over their face but aren't really Yakuza. They're like fake Yakuza. They're like the, Beverly Hills type Yakuza. And, they go in a cosplay on YouTube and, give verdicts of morality against Enson. And I just look at all of that and I say, what a trashy response and a trashy reaction. You want all the traffic and you want all the celebrity from him, but then once something happens to him, boy, you're ready to dispose of him like trash.
Yeah. Miguel, I want to give you a chance to comment. I know you've kind of been waiting to say something here.
No, I find it to be a very interesting situation. Also, a interesting podcast situation in that, I've been in Japan probably 24 times. And, both Zach and Todd have a lot more experience in Japan than I do. So it's a kind of a rare situation. However, I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of disclosure from what I know. I've actually smuggled weed to Japan. I've taken pot, hidden it and gotten through customs, didn't get stopped. At some point, there are very tight. The reason for this is that there is no real drug culture in Japan. In other words, if you were looking to get weed or something like that, you kind of had to know what to do or how to go about it. To be honest with you, there are Iranians that sell shawarma on the streets and stuff, and you could probably pick up hash from them. And then there's the Jamaican doormen and Roppongi and stuff like that, where I've purchased weed in Japan and stuff like that. So it's accessible, but you really got to go looking for it. You really got to, spend time and effort and things like that. In Japan, somewhere in the what's the name of the neighborhood with the big crossroads that everybody knows?
Shibuya.
Shibuya. In Shibuya, there is a couple of small head shops that'll sell, Bob Marley shirts and the shirts with the the leaf and things like that. But as a foreigner, if you ask for a pot, and then they look at you like you're completely out of your mind, and you get absolutely nowhere. So it's very, very difficult to do that. However, there is a tiny, small subculture of it. Eventually, because I've been there a lot, I met a guy who grew marijuana, and he would come to the airport and sell it to us. We meet him at the airport. To be honest with you, we would smoke it right at the airport in the smoking rooms where they smoke cigarettes. So I'll set up a room where they smoke cigarettes. We would go in there and smoke pot. And it's so not in the Japanese culture that people, in America, people would be like, I smell weed. You know what I mean? In Japan, they don't really even readily identify the smell. It could be just an exotic tobacco in terms of what they're thinking and stuff. So we got away with it. And now I look back at it, it's lucky. But you always knew that if you got caught or you were in trouble, that you're not going to get help and that there's not a huge culture of it over there where they're used to it. With that said, You know, I'm talking about weed. I don't know if psilocybin, you know, I almost consider it kind of like weed, and it's kind of a natural substance, and it's not, you know, people aren't killing each other over it in the streets and that sort of stuff. And what really appears to be happening here is personal use amount, you know. And I don't know that the Japanese system is really going to distinguish it, but it's not like he had, you know, 15 kilos on the way and he was selling it, you know, and had a group of kids selling it at schools, right? You know, none of that is even remotely what was going on. It looks like, you know, he may have been trying to get some mushrooms over there to take with his wife and have a peaceful afternoon, you know, watching television or watching, you know, cartoons or whatever it is that he wanted to do. Remember, Kid Yamamoto, who was his student and he was deeply associated with for a long time, was probably the first Japanese fighter character that marijuana became associated with in MMA, as far as I remember. So, you know, and Enson's Hawaiian at the end of the day. You know, it's like in Hawaii, I think that there is what I'm talking about, that culture of like, hey, you know, people use it and, you know, it's more acceptable. And nowadays the laws have changed, you know, in most of the country anyway. So I think, yeah, I think he's on top of everything else. He's being harassed. He's being looked down on in a way that's kind of old school and old culture. And, you know, he's really suffering for nothing, because I don't think that that there was a victim in this crime. It's not like you know, he's selling the kids or anything like that. So I do think it's kind of ridiculous and much ado about nothing.
Well, I mean, this is Japan, you know, it's like
Sure, no,
we
no,
can say it's
I
much ado
understand.
about nothing for us,
Sure,
but for them, it's like, no, this is our society, and you know, that's just all there is to it.
absolutely, I understand that, and you know, Enson, you know, because he's at the end of the day not born in Japan, to earn the respect that he had and has in Japan over the years, there was already a major accomplishment, because there are a lot of, you know, Japanese Americans or whatever that never come close to being respected the way that he was respected. He had come to an understanding and come to a respect level over there that transcended. He was really a special character here, and that's what I think is the big damage here, is that that special status he had as a foreigner that was accepted as one of us, kind of thing, in a way very few were, could be in jeopardy in Japan. And that would be a shame, because, you know, in his old age, that would have been a nice way for him to go down as an elder statesman, kind of.
Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I completely agree. If anything, that we're going to see a lot of what I call otherization against him now. We're gonna otherize him into foreigner status instead of at least half Japanese status. It's similar to what we saw with Ryota Nishida in Japan. No matter how successful he was as a fighter, he never got over in Japan like he did in the States. And so that cultural mix of race and then drugs, it often collides, and whenever someone gets in trouble, what's the first thing that pops up? It's race. So we got to otherize the other person, you know, if they're not pure. And it's regrettable to see it, but it's also regrettable that most people now in Japan don't even know Enson's history in fighting. They just see him as, oh, he's the old thug. You know, he's the old guy shouting at the clouds. They don't look at what he did or what he represented, because they didn't live through the era. And now you've got a new generation trying to write MMA history, and they're going to try to write his history without knowing what he did.
Well, he is on that Breaking Down YouTube show, right?
Yes, which is a regrettable show. I cannot believe he agreed to it, but I understand it, because if you're not part of it, well then, you know, in that case, with a lot of the individuals involved in that show, you know, it's better to try to mitigate some damage rather than completely leave it unscathed and eating itself. But it's not a good show for the MMA scene in Japan. It's certainly different than what you and I know for the scene.
Yeah, why do you think that came about, this whole show? I mean, because I don't know, Miguel, if you've even heard of it. The first I heard of it was when Enson got in trouble, actually. And I went back and watched some. It's kind of like, I
basically
don't
the
even know how to
Japanese Ultimate
describe it,
Fighter.
but
The
worse.
show is like basically like the Japanese Ultimate Fighter. It's produced and backed by an attorney named Teppei Ore. He is the attorney for the Asakura brothers. He's a real estate guy, and he's a classic guy who had a middling career in fighting, but because he had some money and had this dream of like building this mega gym in Japan, he decided the best way to, promote his guys was to build this kind of celebrity circus, and that's what they did. So they took the Ultimate Fighter, they married it with a bunch of like Yakuza wannabe types, stooges, I call them. It's like watching fake Yakuza, not real Yakuza, but like watching these fake guys and then watching some washed up guys from the streets of Osaka. And then they marry them with celebrities, and then we'll figure out, well, we get some retired guys like Bob Sapp and have them do cameos, and we'll have them do it with YouTubers, and we'll do like 30 or 40 1-minute fights in a cage, and we'll sell this, and, we'll try to commercialize it MMA in a tacky way, but like try to, get a lot of eyeballs because it's so fast. It's kind of like how Dana White sounds so ridiculous when he's doing that hard sell for Power Slap on TikTok. That's kind of what we have here. It's really a circus, and all they do is just fight and pretend to, have gang fights, and they don't do anything of substance at all in the show. And Enson was like the first real adult on the show. And so he built up a reputation very quickly as being the scary old guy who actually lived the life and was not a poser. And now all those troublemakers who were scared of him or looked up to him, now they've all turned on him since his arrest and basically destroyed his legacy.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think is going to happen with this?
I would highly suspect that Enson and his wife are going to get deported.
Well, that would be better than sitting in jail for a long time, I would think.
It's possible they may get sentenced and spend some time in prison and then get deported.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just wondering if it wasn't part of something bigger, like this wasn't the first time they looked as mail or something. You know what I mean? If
for
you
sure.
know what I mean?
And look, this is this type of breaking down show. This is exactly the type of show that would attract a lot of enemies politically. And if you're looking for a target to make an example out of, well, who better than Enson?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they know him from his previous incident. But
right. So I mean, I don't know if the people involved in the show are smart enough to get the message that maybe want to go a lower profile, but at this point they're all in. They have their audience, and we'll see what happens, because if the police are not happy with this show continuing, they may start going after some more people on the show.
Miguel, have you ever seen it?
No.
Apparently it gets millions of views on YouTube. It's pretty huge. It's called Breaking Down, and it's kind of like a Japanese version of The Ultimate Fighter, but it's kind of a little more weird. I saw like this guy who looked like he was about 120 pounds try to shoot in on Enson, like, because he was mad at him.
Yes.
It's pretty comic. I don't know if it was real or he was just lost his mind, but it was pretty comical. He had been talking about how he was mad that Enson had called him cute or something,
Yes.
but he never had seen it, Enson in person, and then they had Enson walk in and where he was, and this little guy, like this big, tried to shoot in on him, and Enson like smashed him down and went knee on belly on him real hard. And I don't know if it's real or fake, honestly. But yeah, it's pretty comical.
I mean, the show is just basically, it's a terrible representation of like what old Yakuza used to be, but it's not. I mean, it's like, they're like I don't know how to call it. It's like trailer park trash, like version of like Yakuza wannabes. They're all tatted up and they're like total losers.
Yeah.
And yet they sell them on the show as if they're the ultimate like badass sandpaper, rough paper guys, you know, that like beat up everyone on the streets and did protection money for like forever. And like now they're going to get redeemed because they're now going to be fighting in this 1 minute mixed martial arts fight. It's the biggest joke in the world. And it's a terrible image for Japan. This is where we are right now in 2024 in Japanese mixed martial arts. We're not in a very serious position. Ever since Pride died, the MMA scene has dramatically died in the country as well, and it's a shame because it could be so much more, but there's been a complete vacuum in leadership.
Yeah, and the sad part is that it hadn't materialized that way, and it's been a long time now. But yeah, if we were to dream, Enson might in some way be a person that could act as a leader for a real legitimate scene because of his background and because of his seriousness and gravitas. And as you mentioned, Yakuza versus, kind of wannabe Yakuzas and stuff like that. And Enson's a guy that does understand that aspect of the culture real well and navigates it, in such a way that he breaks it down and makes Americans understand a little bit of how that sort of thing goes. At least in a little bit I've been exposed to him. He's been very, he was an ambassador type that it was already underused, and he's going to be marginalized even further here.
Yeah.
Yes, and the reason for that is because in many respects, he kind of is the last of the old standing guard as far as like the honorable types that used to exist in the fight business over there. Now it's very commercialized and tacky. Yes, you'll see some real fights occasionally on the club level and on the mid-level, but you're not going to see, other than 1 or 2 occasional shows from Ryzen, you're not going to see the major fights you used to see. And the integrity of that whole business now, there's an identity crisis. Nobody knows what they want to be and why they want to be and how long they want to do it. There's no culture because the underlying culture that made mixed martial arts so big in Japan, that itself has been dying.
Why do you think that is?
I always surmised that if the Yakuza went away, that the creativity, the marketing, the spirit of the Japanese people would overcome any challenges on the monetary or the political or cultural front to be so vibrant and actually stand up and challenge, the tacky UFC. And that was a gamble I was completely wrong on. In fact, that's probably my biggest miss of my entire career. I underestimated the absolute stupidity and complete vacuum of low IQ individuals in Japan. Many of them in the promotional class in the space, they're dumber than Americans. And I never thought that was possible. I never in a million years would have ever bet on that. But if you look at the leadership in positions right now in Japan, if you compare them to the Americans, they're not as smart. Right. They're not as creative. They're not as vibrant. And if anything, they're desperate.
Yeah, why hasn't Sakakibara been able to kind of reignite some of that? He just doesn't have you're saying he doesn't have the people behind him.
Well, Nobu's had a second act, and his second act is being a YouTube influencer, and he goes on Instagram and goes to karaoke bars and puts himself over, and he's kind of a uncle, kind of a celebrity to a new generation of fan. But he, once Pride died, he decided pretty much to drop any celebration or any sort of historical worship of Pride and try to build a new identity. And so there's many people in Japan who don't know him from Pride. And he's tried to do a different playbook, and it's had mixed success at best.
One of the other things, a lot of people don't understand that you go back to the mid-'80s, And something very special was happening actually from the pro wrestling world in Japan, where I believe it was UWFI, or I may get the moniker wrong right off the top of my head, but when they splintered and guys left to form Shudo and a separate group formed Pancrase and Maeda went and formed Rings, something very special happened in that the rivalry and competition that genuinely was created there, where they all felt that they were carrying a flag and that their way was the right way, really led to a very special moment in Japan. And you don't have that kind of breeding ground going on right now, especially in pro wrestling, where the pro wrestling world, and I'm no expert on it now, but pro wrestling itself has changed very much from a place where there were shooters and there were people that kept old knowledge kind of thing, and now it's more acrobatics and different types of movesets that turn people on and stuff. So that's one of the things is that was captured in the early days of MMA Japan. The modern MMA era in Japan was that Tiger Mask forming Shudo, and the guys Suzuki and Suzuki. Let's name Suzuki as one of two that formed Pancrase.
Funaki.
Funaki. Thank you.
Yeah.
Those guys, are also kind of sitting, no longer acting and no longer taking on a role either. And those are potential elder statesmen that could step up, but none of them really defined themselves after Pride. And it's been such a long time now that, to rekindle that from those guys, they're now really basically older men. So they never built a new generation, and Japan has been hurting for that scene ever since. And that's a shame. The last real fighter star kind of thing is Aoki, who I remember when Aoki was in the police academy, and now I think he's a 40-year-old. You know what I mean? So it's like we've already seen Aoki's career, and there's no one young in the MMA world that's captured anybody's imagination over there. So it is just a flavor of the week in these, I guess, trashy YouTube shows and things like that, which at the end of the day, everybody's replaceable in that type of format.
Yes, there's just simply no ideology anymore in Japan. There's no longer that battle you're talking about. And without that ideology and without the money, you don't recruit the foreigners to come over like Dan Severn to inspire a new generation and actually teach some guys some things.
Yep, it's really a shame because, like I said, that history dating back to the mid '80s in Japan, where that company of pro wrestling and the hard style was kind of a guardian of older knowledge from the '70s and from the '60s of real fighting knowledge. Who's guarding the knowledge now?
And these were people who had massive egos and were celebrities, and they had so much pride, pardon the pun, that they had to defend their egos at all costs, and that created some violent situations which they had to defend. But, I mean, if you go back to when everything started to fall apart, it was with Hickson taking care of Yoji Enjo.
Yeah. But, I mean, even some of the lesser promotions like Shuto and Pancrase that had a lot of foreign fighters competing in them don't anymore.
No, they don't. They can't afford it. And that's what makes the Enson story so sad, is because people still attach Shudo to Enson, and that historical data point for both of them really was so big. And to see that get, tarnished is really bad.
Because Shudo was about as good as anything back in the day, and it's like nothing now. It's depressing.
Yes.
And I thought maybe they could fill the vacuum if Pride had went away, because Shudo was so professional. But if anything, they've gone backwards. And that's probably because of how many UFC events there are, and guys really don't need to fight in Japan anymore,
Right, and you have this combination of Shudo and Pancras and Psyche's Deep and all these little club groups. They don't have any money anymore. And you have Shu Harada, who's taking a lot of Japanese talent, and he's getting them out of the country, getting them to American Top Team or to other places in foreign gyms, and he's now going to get them in the UFC pipeline.
And with Shudo, there comes a point where I feel like they were possibly the most advanced philosophy in MMA if you go back to the early 90s. But I think by isolating themselves, they really did themselves harm. And then, they had some bad luck and things like that in terms of, their absolute superstar and their loyal superstar, Sato, they ran into the ground basically, and I can't believe that other MMA fighters at this point would look at Sato and want to emulate his career. Whereas, for the first half of it, obviously, he was that guy. He was the guy that everybody would want to be or be like or be near, but they used him up. And then they lost other guys like Sakurai and Uno who didn't want to go that path, and they became very bitter with that, and that's a shame. And Pancrase was always, basically at the whim of the owner of Don Quixote,
And really, Bushido, when the Pride established that Bushido series, that really was the Shudo killer.
Yeah, hitting the smaller weight classes for sure.
Yeah, why do you think Shudo never regained a foothold? I mean, after Pride went away, why were they never able to step up, you think? Money. Yeah. So I guess
now a lot of those Shudo guys are basically stuntmen. They train a lot of people to do stunts in movies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing I do wonder about is, they never really seemed to capitalize off of that huge match between Tenshin and Takeru, which kind of captured the imagination of everybody. And instead of trying to hit and, try to capitalize off of that, they just did nothing.
And that was a giant mistake because, remember, Sakakibara had his own Yakuza scandal around the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then the main producer for Obama, his name is Yuji Kitano, he ended up working very closely with Takeru to pull him over to Chatri in one to promote his fight in the One Ring in Japan. And then Mr. Kitano got a lesson of a lifetime when Chatri said, no, he's my guy. He's not your guy. And we're going over to the rival company called Unext and see you later. So, even the Japanese leaders, the TV producers that used to do the mixed martial arts scene, they're long gone. And now you have kind of a newer generation of digital media types who think that because they're fight fans, that they can do the job that their predecessors used to do, and they're just as bigger marks as the Americans are. They're not any smarter or any clever or any bigger or any wiser.
What do you think about Shu Harada? I mean, he's the prominent manager in Japan as far as a lot of these UFC guys go.
Well, Shu has his thing, and he obviously sees what we see, which is Japan's a chaotic mess, and there's no stability. And at some point, if you're going to rely on that to be a manager or to make a career out of it, you're not going to make a lot of money. And so you just have to follow the money, and that's kind of what his path has been. His theory all along is that there's not going to be a major Japanese scene that's going to rebuild itself. You have to go where the money is, and UFC's the monopoly, and he's trying to figure out how to get these fighters out of Japan so they're not scandalized or get caught up in stupid shows like Breaking Down. And the instant arrest, in many respects, validates Shu's strategy because, God forbid, one of those Japanese fighters gets caught testing positive for weed. that has destroyed their career in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Miguel.
Yeah, no, at the end of the day, Shu's been a survivor. Because he goes back to the old days. I used to get fighters for Euphoria and Bodog from Japan through Shu as well. And as a testimony to his staying power, he's still out there doing the connecting thing. And what he brings more than anybody else is the ability to communicate pretty seamlessly with Japan, in terms of that. I believe he's born in Japan and moved to New York when he was 10 years old. Or the story might be reversed, where he was born in New York and moved to Japan when he was 10 years old. But he manages both of those languages, which is very difficult, in such a way that he's been able to stay in power. And even at some point where he may have had ups and downs with the UFC, and the UFC may not have liked the power he had with Japanese fighters, and may have tried to Monte Cox him, so to speak. They weren't able to get rid of him. So he's helping out a lot of Japanese fighters, and it goes back to the old days where, imagine Okami, for example, and Okami being one of the first guys that fought, for the UFC world title back in the day and stuff like that. And then, since he's expanded, he's actually got a stable of fighters. It's not only Japanese fighters. So he's one of the power players in the sport now. Yeah, he no longer takes my phone calls.
Right. He's a very busy man. He's busy going to doubleheaders with the Mets and the Dodgers. He's busy being a celebrity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he actually his best client is still Max Holloway. So, to give him credit, he did always have a certain eye for talent, and he's still out there doing it. And whatever little bit of talent rises to the top in Japan, he's there to grab and help, and at least make some money. So at the very, he's got a role that nobody's gonna take away from him right now.
Zach, I want to ask you about ONE FC, because obviously they're trying to get a foothold in Japan a little bit. I want to ask you what you think of ONE FC when it comes to Japan.
Where do we want to start? I think after that first show they had in Japan, that it was such a nightmare for everyone involved, that now all their efforts seem to be towards America, trying to attract more money by running shows in America. And all I have to say to them is good luck.
Yeah, I think that's a fail too. You got to keep in mind in 2023, they came forth with a plan to do 2 shows. They actually only did 1. They haven't been back since. They've been trying to get distribution. They do a good job on social media, and they've done a decent job of grabbing some of the talent that's left not in the UFC's clutches, and signing them and bringing them out there. But it's few and far between. I don't see them getting a foothold anywhere in the United States either. And the UFC just won this settlement lawsuit, and they won't change their business practices or their contracts or anything like that, at least in the immediate future, because as a repercussion of that settlement. But I believe it's not out of the realm of possibility that one's contracts are actually more illegal and more restrictive, what they're used to being, what they're allowed to use, and what they are used to using in Asia, that would be illegal in the United States market. So I think that they are looking at an uphill battle before they can operate in the United States with any consistency.
They do have this show in Denver coming up.
I've always argued that as far as ONE FC is concerned, they're more a talent agency in terms of those contracts than they are a promoter.
Yeah. Yeah, like I say, the contract is based on laws, I guess, in Singapore or in the jurisdictions that they operate over there, and just laws are different. So they are able to put in different types of controls and items like that that would be illegal in the United States. So, and also actually the pay scales on the lower end of what the UFC offers. It's semi comparable, but they actually don't quite pay as much. And you know, like I say, even the show that they did in the United States, there were hints that you know, if they can take advantage of somebody and get them real cheap, they'll take it, and they won't pay anybody just to, you know, set a standard or do anything like that. They'll just go ahead and save the money. And at the end of the day, I don't know that that's the case. With the UFC at least has minimums where you know, everybody fights for at least 10,000 nowadays, or that sort of thing.
Well, we go back to what you were saying earlier. I don't even know what the ideology or the fight style is of one. I mean, are they an MMA promotion, a Muay Thai promotion? I have no clue. They're just a circus. And just like Japan, if you don't have an ideology or a system or a philosophy, how are you going to attract that competitive spirit to be a major player?
Yeah, you know, I agree with you. First of all, they're not. I think the one critical factor people don't recognize that what the UFC did or what Zuffa did with the UFC is to ramp up to the point where there are weekly shows and that they're distributed, even if it's on different channels, makes them extremely powerful. Whereas these other companies from Bellator to One and everything like that stick to one distributor. So therefore, you know, they're restricted, are not able to do weekly shows because the distribution doesn't give them enough power to do so. And that's limited one's ability to do certain things. Like, for example, you know, One was flirting with Ngannou. And you know, that fell apart for him, and the negotiations didn't come forward there. The bottom line is they also have Gordon Ryan signed. Now, you know, nobody.
I don't think they do anymore. I think that ship sailed.
No, but
Yeah.
no one even talked about the potential for that match, and there would have been one of the few marquee matches that could have been made with characters that are not in the UFC that people would actually have paid attention to, and I'm the only person who's ever mentioned it. You know what I mean? It's like, so their potential is left just that as potential. You know, the grappling league, it's they do have some very intense grappling. They do have in Matt Hume, one of the premier eyes, you know, talent scouts or talent people in the whole world. And if you look at some of the grappling, you know, they've done jiu-jitsu versus Sambo world champions in absolutely very compelling matches. You know, even in the heavyweight division, they just in the last year or so, the match between Buchetta and Rugrud was a standout match. It was better than any UFC match I've seen in the heavyweight division in a long time in the UFC. But again, they just get left at that. And again, their talent tends to be Eastern, you know, Eastern European or Eastern Asian, or, you know, not American based. And unfortunately, that's not going to help them in this market either. So yeah, like I said, they're an incomplete. They haven't put all the puzzle pieces together. They're an incomplete project still. And there's always going to be questions about their finances. And when they come to the United States and they have to be more open and forthcoming about it, I think that's one of the things that's prevented them from executing a plan in the United States.
Zach, maybe elaborate on what you meant by talent agency versus promoter a little bit.
Those contracts, they're based in Singapore. Remember, Singapore uses the British common system, which is different than the American court system. Make of that what you will. But they're very much about IP rights and percentages and intellectual property. And what is the value of one but for those assets, for submitting and giving away the lifetime, you know, IP of someone as a fighter, as a personality, of the title belts and everything else that comes with those detailed contracts. But at the end of the day, whether it's ONE, whether it's PFL, you look at all these alternatives supposedly to UFC, and not at one point can you point to those companies and say that there's any sort of not only ideology, but there's no heart and soul. And I think to put a bow on all this story, if you look back at what Enson did in his career, you look back at what TJ Thompson did, you look back at the scene in Hawaii, you look back at what Scott Coker did in San Jose, whatever you thought of the men and the fighters, there was heart, there was soul, there was determination, there was an intensity and a pride and a feeling of family and competitive spirit that we were being pioneers, that we were doing something, that we actually represented something bigger than just us. And you do not get any of that emotion, any of that feeling, any of that strategy at all from any of the wannabe McDonald's competitors to UFC. It's all process, it's all financing, it's all corporate, it's all commercial, and it's tacky. It's lost the heart and spirit of what made us fight fans in the first place.
That's a good point. How would you capture that, you think?
You have to celebrate and embrace people who did it and make sure that those are the people who are well capitalized, not the Don Davises of the world, not Chatri, not your Harvard Business Review geeks, none of those people. If you're not in the fight business and if you're not someone who sacrificed in the business, you're not going to understand how to completely capture the essence of the business when you promote. These people just promote spreadsheets. They're not promoting actual fists. They're not promoting, submissions. And that's a big problem because so much of our history now is just on the sidelines and no one seems to want to celebrate it. If anyone wants to celebrate it, they're often scolded for doing so because there's such an effort by a new generation to not only take the current product, but then completely rewrite the history of the business. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen to Enson Inoue in his, not only his life, but his career and everything that he worked for. It's all going to be flushed down the toilet, and it's going to be done so in a gleeful manner by people who have ulterior motives that have nothing to do with the fight business or anything of integrity or honesty.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, it's a strong statement to make. Like I was just looking at it from just this is a crime kind of thing, but you've really delved into like the history and the heart and soul of everything when you're talking about this. Let me ask you about the Pride thing. I mean, I know you wrote a lot about the demise of Pride. Did you ever get any kind of drama from doing that from the people involved?
People in and out of orbit. My life was a living hell during that time, but what I learned from that story, Todd, is being first or being right when it comes to a story in the fight business does not get you rewarded. It gets you punished, because bad news is not good news for fans, and it's definitely not good news for fighters. And if it costs fighters money, then they got to go find something else to do with their lives. If it comes to fans, then they lose the sugar high of watching great fights. And they blame you rather than blame the problem that existed or what happened. And the truth was, everyone during that time in Pride was flying by the seat of their pants. Every show, from show to show, from contract to contract, fight to fight, even up until the minute before the fight happened, it was pure chaos. And that was what made Pride so exciting. But in the end, that kind of chaos, unfortunately, in today's environment, succumbs to a corporate system.
Yeah. Miguel?
Yeah, no, I agree that, even at Hook and Shoot, where we were smaller, but we definitely had that element of trying to write our niche and making sure that, we were doing things that were meaningful on a bigger scale, like creating matches with international guys when, you know, a local promotion like ours really had no business being, you know, monetarily that way. And, you know, where are we going to get the money? It's like, you know, I spent a lot of my own money, and, you know, I spent a lot of time procuring sponsors who at that point, they were also, you know, to name names from, you know, from Dan Lambert to even Sheik Taknoon to a certain extent, to Vlad, to people like that. They were passionate sponsors. They were passionate sponsors about the fight game. Again, they didn't really care about, you know, spreadsheets and things like that. I remember with Vlad at one point, which was the Euphoria show, we were doing an 8-man tournament, and the second round fights were up, and I was going to do Eve Edwards against Joaquin Hansen. That was my fight, and Pride had allowed Joaquin Hansen to compete in the first round of the tournament, but when Pride saw that fight, they stepped in and invoked Joaquin's contract and didn't let him do it. And at that point, when the fight fell apart, I allowed Eve Edwards to go back to the UFC and fight. And Vlad called me up and said, I'm going to sue Eve Edwards. I don't want him fighting for the UFC. And then he backed off. He said, nah, go ahead, let him do it. Because at the end of the day, it was the right thing to do. Now you would actually see these types of promoters actually go ahead and invoke that clause and prevent fighters for their own aggrandizement and not for the betterness of the sport. And, you know, we did the right thing almost to a fault, and that's probably one of the reasons we're not operating anymore. But I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Zach's talking about, is that a lot of that passion and, you know, marching towards a common goal of making something bigger than ourselves and things like that just doesn't exist anymore.
As Miguel said, how many people right now in the business are willing to put their money where their mouth is? None of these people in positions of power, whether they want to be UFCs or if they just want to have a piece of the action, none of them want to lose any money anymore. They're spending someone else's money. Chatri spent hundreds of millions of dollars of money from Singapore and Qatar and other governments, which is taxpayer money. Don Davis is trying to spend Wall Street money. None of these people in their core, the reason they don't understand the business is because part of it is they realize if they had to spend their own money, they would actually have to learn what makes the business tick, and none of them are willing to do it because they're all trying to hustle and sell a process story, not a story of substance.
All right, Don Davies, the PFL guy, is a perfect example. Like you said, he's a guy that came over with, you know, business resume and you know, I don't know if he was a billionaire, but I believe that type of word gets touted around with him and stuff like that. But again, you know, when the PFL needs money to run, you hear about them, you know, in Qatar drumming up investments and things like that. He's not putting up 1 red cent of his own money.
Yeah. It's a I want to ask you something, Zach. I know we're kind of on an hour here. I don't want to go take up all your time. I mean, we could talk. I'd love to bring you back, kind of do like a Demise of Pride show, because I know you were writing a lot about that back then. But I want to know what you thought of this UFC settlement, and also maybe kind of where we're at with the sport now.
Well, I'd love to do a show with you about Pride, because I will tell you right now, whatever show is done by Vice for the issue of Pride, eventually when they'll get to it, I'm sure they will. It'll be a train wreck. It'll just be a nightmare. And I don't participate in a lot of these shows or these offers because I know they're not going to tell the history, and they're not going to talk to the right people. They're going to tell the story they want to tell. And ultimately, everyone's conflicted out. So you never get the true history or the flavor of the moment because so many people who would tell it, they're no longer with us, or, you know, they're going to be silenced by those who have the message and the production equipment to do so. So there's that. But as far as where the sport is right now with antitrust and everything else, I mean, I published an article today about Ari Emanuel and how this guy is one of the biggest power players in American politics in 2024. And part of that is because he has officially killed any sort of future antitrust action for the mixed martial arts or combat sports space. The settlement for the UFC fighters on that front all but eliminates any sort of future labor progress in the sport. I do not see a fighters association. I do not see the feds or state governments implementing any sort of Ali Act for the sport. I don't see it. And as long as Ari Emanuel is the billionaire who is basically a mercenary contractor for every state, local, and federal and world government, they all have incentive not to regulate and oversee the well-being of fighters in the sport. And so we're just going to get more and more McDonald'sification of the sport, and we're losing the heart and soul of it, which is why whenever I see these stories about Enson or Randy Couture, it breaks my heart, because these were guys that sacrificed everything and paid the ultimate price, and they're just disposable now to this new generation. And I see the writing on the wall, and no one else seems to want to cover what they did and where they stand and why they should be covered and honored and appreciated, and at least acknowledge whether you agree with what they do or not. And instead, we've got, kind of like a hive mentality now of these online digital MMA fans who don't know anything. And I'm very fearful of where this sport is, if you want to call it that, is going, because I don't think it's a sport anymore. I think we're watching the conversion of mixed martial arts from sports into a political machine. That's where I think the heart and soul of those in power are not in sports, they're in politics.
That's interesting.
And you see that more and more with Dana becoming a guest on, like, all of a sudden Dana White's opinion on, the presidency or on, social matters, like, the woke and crap like that. Now all of a sudden he's a voice, and he's a legitimate voice that's out there and sought after. And I do believe that that's, as Zach pointed out, that's been a very deliberate addition to his personality, that he's no longer just the fight guy, that he's branched out to do more political machination for the company. It creates more money for them at the end.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to see where things are going. And yeah, Zach, I appreciate you taking the time. I know we've kind of gone on an hour here, but I'd love to bring you back, do like a history of pride, some of the things you wrote about leading up to the end and things like that, and kind of get real in depth to it if you wanted to, because I know you wrote some just crazy stuff, and tons of it, back then.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to talk with all of you, and hopefully your listeners, they can reach out to me anytime. I'm on Twitter at Fight Opinion, or you can read my work at themmadraw.com and stay in touch with us.
Yeah, Zach does some great work in
catch
writing.
up, Zach. Nice to hear your voice again.
Thank you so much, guys. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, take care. Yeah, so this is Todd Atkins, and for everyone that listened to this episode, we appreciate it. Zach Arnold, we'll bring you more of him. He wrote some, like I said, as far as writing goes, I don't know if there was really anybody better, over the last, since the beginning, a couple of decades. And everyone that enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it, subscribe, and we appreciate it. Until next time, take care.
Live to Fight is the type of company that Dana killed. It's a homegrown, it's a guy that just does good work and, puts it out there. And if you can support him, you really should, because he's precisely a guy who can't, his banners may not be able to hang on the UFC because he hasn't been able to pay them $100,000 to get his stuff out there. That's the corporate stuff that we're talking about now with the UFC, that, they've made everything at that level where it's all about money for them. And Live to Fight is a dude that does good work, makes you a great banner, and, doesn't have $100,000 to get on the UFC and stuff, and deserves support. So any fighter out there, anybody out there, owner of a gym or anything like that listens to us, God bless you and thank you very much for your support. And extend that to Live to Fight, because he's one of us. Those guys are one of us.